Welcome to Transnational Competition Law course, and dear learner and viewer, today I am going to discuss the competition law in Brazil, and you can well recollect and recall my previous lecture on the constitutional dimension of the Brazilian constitution in promoting and spawning competition law right from the constitution which has been enacted by the Brazil in 1946, and thereafter we have seen that the constitution has undergone to massive amendment in 1969, 1967, 1969, and altogether we find a new constitution put in place in 1998, and another new constitution we got in the Brazil is the Brazil Constitution 2001, and then it was also subjected to the amendment in 2004 and 2006, and how the very umbrella notion of the social function of the private property happens to be one of the very important segment to look at the competition law and policy, having a competitive market, having a free competition, having a consumer protection, having a due dignity of the labor and the individual, as well as the promotion of social justice. With the discussion which we had in the former lecture, in the previous lecture, now we will be taking a stock of the Brazil's competition law directly, and we have divided our discussion to look at the Brazil's competition law under the three major categories. And the three major categories happens to be, one is the classical, another happens to be the neoclassical, and another happens to be the modern competition law in Brazil. In lectures to be followed, we will be discussing that how the Brazil happens to be a very extravagant arrangement of the competition law in its jurisdictions right from 1962 down to this day, although we find some of the reminiscences of the competition law much prior to the competition law number 4137 enacted in 1962 and much prior to the Brazilian Constitution's enactment in 1946. So we have a large number or the plethora of the competition law in Brazil, and all those laws needs a careful understanding to understand and grapple that the transnational competition law in the context of the BRICS nations, especially in the Brazilian context. Dear learner, having said so, we will directly say that the first law in a technical sense of the term on the competition law and enforcement pertains to the law which was enacted in 1962 and called law number 4137 on the competition law, which has been able to create what we hear time and again, and we have many success stories attributed to heralding in competition jurisprudence in Brazil or in extraterritorial application of competition law, as well as the transnational application of the competition law, is the establishment, creation and establishment of Administrative Council for Economic Defense, which is known as CAD in a Portuguese language, shortly abbreviated, and it read like this: Conselho Administrativo de Defesa Econômica, or we can shortly abbreviate as CAD, and in English version of the CAD is Administrative Council of the Economic Defense, which has been created, and this body has since last 60 years have been meticulously engaged in handing down a very rich jurisprudence on the competition law enforcement at national, regional, blocks, as well as in extraterritorial application and as well as in matters of transnational application of the competition law. But prior to that, we see that there has been law, and what I mean to say that what is the classical law? The classical law on the competition begins with decree law number 869 of 1938, which talks as of the competition as a national security matter. So the very understanding of the classical competition law, which is beyond and which is earlier to or the precursor to the competition law of 1962, and which is also predates to the constitution of the Brazil in 1946. This decree law number 869 of 1938 tries to subscribe that the competition as a national security issue, and the first Brazilian competition law was handed down in the shape of the decree law number 7666 in 1945. So this is the another milestone in the enactment of the competition law. The third law we come across happens to be the law number 7347, which talks about class action procedure for the consumer rights. And then we have the antitrust conduct law in 1919, criminal offense law of 18137, and the Brazilian system of economic defense of 1994. So, taken together, we see the sum of the laws technically passed prior to the competition law number 4137, which was enacted in 1962 and which has historically and established the CAD, a national competition authority, which happens to be an umbrella organization to guide all subsidiary competition authority within the Brazilian soil. But equally interesting are the laws which seems to have as far back as in 1938 decree law number 869, which have enunciated the principles of competition as a matter of national security. Then the decree law number 7666 of 1945. These laws pertains to prior to the 1962 law on competition, and in the post competition law 4137 of 1962, a mixed bag of all the relevant and the compatible law which has its direct implication on the construction of the competition law and policy in Brazil happens to be the antitrust conduct of 1990 and the criminal offense law 8137. Because, dear learner and viewer, we should understand the Brazilian law believes in the prosecutorial strategy of the enactment of the competition law, and it tries to punish for the violation of the competition law, applying more to the criminal law than that of the civil law. In that reference, the criminal offense law number 8137 assumes additional significance, and overall, the Brazilian system of economic defense, this is also one of the most prestigious body. Besides, we have the Administrative Council of Economic Defense, or the CAD, in existence, that it has a very supplementary role and complementary role in promoting the competition in Brazil. And then we have the law for the class action by the consumer if their rights are set at naught and has been infringed in matters of promotion of competition law. So, taking the competition law of 1938 and competition law of 1945 taken together, the subsidiary laws which help is the consumer law for the class action and the antitrust conduct of 1990 and the criminal law offense law which also have a very direct impact besides having a law on Brazilian system of economic defense. This is the entire purview of the classical competition law in Brazil. What we see that in 1988, coincidentally, there happens to be a series of significant economic changes in Brazil. A new constitution was put in place, and that new constitution has envisioned a new kind of an economic order, and that tried to redefine and redesign the entire competition structure and as well as the competition law. The mandate of the economic changes and the constitutional changes in the Brazil in 1988 relates to primarily that all the privatization programs which was launched as a barrier to the international trade to be reduced, and CAD as an umbrella organization for promotion of the competition law became very active and pivotal in looking at all the competition law issues. Therefore, what we see that though we have a law on competition in 1962 and even we have a law prior to that, and even we have some supplementary law after 1962, but the changes and the new vision which has been inserted into the very conspectus of the competition law by the Constitution of 1988 is very important in the sense that it has laid down the foundation for the modern era of competition policy in Brazil, which technically begins in 1994, and therefore we see that in response to the hyperinflation, the real plan was implemented in 1994, and the broad feature of that real plan in 1994 was the introduction of the tight fiscal and the prof credit policies with new currency, and that pegged to the US dollar. So whatever the slew of reform which has taken place in 1988 in the name of constitution, and what happens to be the slew of reform which has taken place under the economic reforms and the economic policy in Brazil in 1994, taken together, we have a new competition law number 8884 in 1992, which enacted with the expectation that it could be employed to deal the issue of the inflated price in the market. And it, in a real sense, the competition law of 1992 will be a great law in the sense of curbing all kinds of monopolistic tendencies, the hoarding, the hyperinflation, and the inflation of the prices. Therefore, what we see that on the strength of these constitutional and economic changes and the promulgation of the economic policy, we find that there happens to be an economic law national secretariat was established in the Ministry of Justice. A secretariat on economic policy was established in the Ministry of Finance. An economic law national secretariat was established in Ministry of Justice and as well as in the Secretariat of Economic Policy. And then we see that the Secretariat of Economic Monitoring and the body which was created by the strength of 1967 law known as Brazilian System of Economic Defense worked together to see how the competition law of 1962 and competition law of 1992 happens to have a very safe passage. With this, what we feel is the fact that the competition law under the classical purview happens all requisites of a modern competition law. Nonetheless, because of some of the prolific legislative development, we try to see these law in the category of the classical competition law. Next, dear learner and viewer, we will be discussing the neoclassical competition law, and by saying the neoclassical competition law, we mean to suggest that the development which have taken place in Brazil and movement from coming out of the impasse of the colonial creation of the typical Brazil and the slow implementation of a successful economy which contrast the pre-Caucasus state building in Brazil, and the Brazil's unified state came before consolidation of the integrated economy. And in that reference we see that the Brazilian state was inducer of industrial economy, and it was having a modern system in the core and the peripheral economic matters. And thus we see that the Brazilian antitrust law number 4137 of 1962, which created CAD on the basis of the Portuguese acronym, we find the antitrust law of 1962 a kind of a law as the first competition law in a technical sense. We try to project the entire view of the Brazilian legislation of competition defense, and then this antitrust law of 1962 had the primary purpose of regulating the repression or to the abuse of the dominance and the economic power in the market. And according to the Federal Constitution of 1946, we see the same law and the same body known as CAD, which has been created by the competition law of 1962, happens to herald a great economic impact, and the authority extended not only to the private firms, but its application and functional ambit was extended to the public companies. Thus, the 1962 law, which has a very powerful impact, the another law which we had in 1994, Brazilian antitrust law number 8884, it tries to put the competition policy in Brazil, and it tries to have a kind of a mirror image of the changes which have been brought by the Constitution of Brazil, and as well as the economic policy and the real plan of the economic policies underpinned under 1994. Therefore, the 1994 law on the competition in Brazil has all capacity to combat the anti-competitive practices and have legitimately given rise to the expectation that it could serve and deal effectively the inflated prices. Thus, we see that in the Brazilian competition policy system, whether that be 1962 Brazilian competition law or 1994 Brazilian competition law, there happens to be the three agencies, and that is something very important, that how the Brazilian competition policy system has been so exotic in understanding that besides CAD, we must have some other bodies, and some other bodies besides CAD happens to be the Economic Law Office in the Ministry of Justice, and the another happens to be the Secretariat for Economic Monitoring in the Ministry of Finance. Thus, the three agencies taken together happens to be a novel creation of the antitrust law of 1994 in the backdrop of the real plan and the new economic plan, as well as some of the new constitutional demands and the expectation of the constitutions of 1998, and the creation of these authorities and three agencies, although they have their separate jurisdiction, separate power, separate enforcement, separate responsibilities, and then these authorities have given and managed the entire competition law in Brazil in such a way that the other countries are bound to refer and recall the very working of the competition law vis-a-vis the economic law, vis-a-vis the constitutional law, vis-a-vis the kind of the elaborate competition, national authority and a structure which has been created in Brazil to give effect to competition laws and policy not only in Brazil but beyond Brazil, having a direct impact on the transnational competition law. Dear learner, we see that our discussion, besides the constitutional notion of the competition in Brazil, the discussion on the classical competition law and the neoclassical competition law will be having a kind of, will bring some clarity as to how the transnational competition law to be understood in reference to BRICS and in reference to Brazil. With this, I thank and I wish a happy learning.